In 1962, it would have cost about $50,000 to put out a fire under the borough of Centralia, Pennsylvania. Nobody spent the money. By 1983, the price had risen to $660 million. Nobody spent that either. Instead, Congress wrote a check for $42 million, not to fight the fire, but to move the people out of its way. The fire is still burning. It has been burning for more than 60 years. Engineers say it could burn for another 250, and somewhere beneath the empty streets of Centralia, beneath the grid of curbs that lead to nothing and the sidewalks that end in grass, billions of dollars worth of anthracite coal, some of the purest, hardest, hottest burning coal on the planet, is slowly turning to ash. Centralia sits in Columbia County, in the anthracite belt of northeastern Pennsylvania, at the intersection of Routes 61 and 42. If you drive north on 61 from Ashland today, you'll notice the road makes an odd bend, a bypass that wasn't there before 1993. The original highway used to run straight through town. That stretch is gone now, paved over with dirt. The borough covers a quarter of a square mile. In 1890, nearly 2,800 people lived in it. In 2020, the census counted 5. The land that became Centralia changed hands several times before anyone understood what it was worth. Robert Morris, signer of the Declaration of Independence, financier of the Revolution, owned these acres at the end of the 18th century. He went bankrupt in 1798, and the land passed on. In 1770, colonial surveyors had pushed the ridding road through this stretch of mountain wilderness, linking the town of Reading to Fort Augusta on the Susquehanna. That road would eventually become Route 61, the spine that connected Centralia to the outside world for over a century. But in those early years, this was just forest and ridgeline. Nobody was looking for coal yet. They found it anyway. By the 1830s and 1840s, the presence of anthracite in the surrounding hills was well known. A tavern keeper named Jonathan Faust opened the Bull's Head Tavern in 1841, the first commercial establishment in the area, and the settlement that grew around it took the tavern's name. Then, in 1842, the Locust Mountain Coal and Iron Company bought the land. Their mining engineer, a man named Alexander Rea, came to the valley with his family and began laying out streets and residential lots. He called the settlement Centerville. The name would later be changed to Centralia to avoid confusion with another Centerville over in Schuylkill County, a detail that sounds trivial until you realize it's the Postal Service, not geology, that gave this town its permanent name. For a decade, the coal sat largely untapped. The problem wasn't the coal itself. Anthracite was in furious demand across the industrializing Northeast, burning hotter and cleaner than any other fossil fuel available, but getting it out of the valley. There was no railroad. You can't profitably haul coal by wagon over mountain roads. Everything changed in 1854 with the construction of the Mine Run Railroad. Suddenly, coal could move. The Locust Run Mine and the Coal Ridge Mine opened in 1856. The Hazeldell Colliery followed in 1860, the Centralia Mine in 1862, the Continental in 1863. Each one drew more workers. The borough was formally incorporated in February of 1866, and by that point about 1,300 people lived there. To put a number like that in perspective, Harrisburg, the state capital, had only about 23,000. Now picture Locust Avenue, Centralia's main street, in the years that followed. It ran roughly north-south through the center of town, lined on both sides with wood frame buildings pressed close together, hotels, dry goods stores, saloons with swinging half doors and sawdust floors. The sidewalks were plank. The street was unpaved, muddy in spring, frozen in winter, loud with wagon traffic year-round. Coal dust settled on everything. You could taste it when you breathed. And the men who walked Locust Avenue at the end of a shift, Irish immigrants mostly, though later Ukrainians, Poles, Lithuanians, carried themselves the way miners everywhere do, with a specific kind of exhaustion that lives in the shoulders. Alexander Rea, the man who had drawn those streets, who had platted the lots and given the town its grid, would not live to see it reach its peak. On October 17, 1868, Rea was traveling by buggy between Centralia and the neighboring town of Mount Carmel when he was ambushed and beaten to death. His killers were members of the Molly Maguires, a clandestine network of Irish-American miners who operated throughout the anthracite region in the 1860s and 1870s. The Mollies, as they were known, were fighting, sometimes with arson, sometimes with murder, against mine owners they viewed as exploiters. Whether they were labor activists or criminals depends on who is telling the story and when. What's beyond dispute is that Centralia was a hotbed of their activity and that their violence touched the town repeatedly. Other incidents included arson and the killing of a local priest. 3 men were eventually convicted of Rhea's murder and hanged in Bloomsburg in March of 1878. The founder of Centralia had been dead for a decade by then. The town he left behind, though, was thriving. The federal census of 1890 recorded 2,761 residents, Centralia's all-time peak. Consider what that quarter of a square mile contained at its height. 7 churches, 5 hotels, 27 saloons, 2 theaters, a bank, a post office, and 14 general and grocery stores. 27 saloons for a population under 3,000. That ratio tells you everything about who lived there, what their work was like, and what they needed when the shift was over. The hotels catered to traveling salesmen, mine inspectors, and the occasional company official. The theaters ran vaudeville acts and, later, motion pictures. The churches, Catholic, Ukrainian Catholic, Protestant, reflected the layered immigration that had built the town, each wave of arrivals establishing its own parish, its own language, its own corner of Locust Avenue. If you'd stood at the intersection of Locust Avenue and Center Street in 1890, you'd have seen a town that felt permanent. The buildings were solid, the mines were producing. The Lehigh and Mahanoy Railroad, branching from the Lehigh Valley Railroad, carried coal out of the valley by the trainload, tens of thousands of tons per year, headed for the furnaces and stoves and factories of Philadelphia, New York, Boston. The railroad didn't just carry coal out, it brought the world in. Goods, newspapers, machinery, people. Centralia's merchants stocked their shelves with products from cities the miners would never visit. The 5 hotels kept their rooms filled. On paydays, the saloons did the kind of business that would make a modern bar owner weep with envy. This was a town that ran on cash, on weekly wages spent within walking distance of where they were earned. Every dollar the mines paid out circulated through Locust Avenue before it left town. You might not have noticed, standing there amid that commerce, that the entire economy rested on a single commodity extracted from directly underfoot, or that the coal companies, not the townspeople, owned the mineral rights to everything beneath the surface. The people of Centralia owned their houses. They did not own what their houses stood on top of. That arrangement, surface rights for the residents, subsurface rights for the companies, was standard across the anthracite region. It wouldn't matter much until it mattered enormously. The peak didn't last. Anthracite production across Pennsylvania crested around the time of the First World War. Many young miners from Centralia enlisted and left. After the war, a series of strikes weakened output further, and then a competitor arrived that anthracite couldn't match on price: cheap fuel oil. Oil burned clean enough, heated well enough, and cost less. The market was shifting, and a town built on one product had no second act. The Wall Street crash of 1929 drove the nail. The Lehigh Valley Coal Company, which had operated extensively in the area, shuttered 5 of its mines in and around Centralia. Unemployment hit the town like a physical blow. And here is where a detail enters the story that seems minor at the time, but becomes devastating later. During the Depression, desperate men turned to what was called bootleg mining. They entered the abandoned shafts, mines the companies had closed and walked away from, and began extracting coal on their own, illegally, selling it for whatever they could get. By 1930, in the town of Centralia alone, where nearly all legitimate coal production had already ceased, the number of bootleg miners at least tripled. The writer Louis Adamick, who traveled through the anthracite region in the early 1930s, described convoys of coal trucks thundering past his roadside hotel all night. Trucks loaded with bootleg coal, rattling down mountain highways to buyers who asked no questions. To maximize what they pulled out, many of these bootleg miners used a technique called pillar robbing. In a properly operated mine, columns of coal are left in place to support the roof. The pillar robbers took those columns. The roofs collapsed. The abandoned mines became a honeycomb of interconnected voids, collapsed passages, and uncharted tunnels stretching beneath the town in every direction. Nobody mapped what they'd done. Nobody could. Those voids would matter. Remember them. Coal production picked up briefly with the outbreak of World War II, but the respite was temporary. By 1950, Centralia's population had dropped to 1,986. And in that year, the Borough Council did something unusual, something that, depending on how you read it, was either optimistic or desperate. They acquired the mineral rights to all the anthracite beneath Centralia. A 1949 state law had made the transaction possible. The council was betting that coal would come back, that the deposits beneath their own streets would someday be worth extracting again. It was, in its way, an act of faith in the future. The borough of Centralia, uniquely among the municipalities in its region, owned the coal under its own feet. Through the 1950s, the town contracted but didn't die. People still lived there, still raised families, still walked Locust Avenue past the remaining shops and the churches. By 1960, the population was 1,435. The mines were mostly closed, the commercial mining companies gone. But Centralia was a community. It had a municipal building, a fire company, its churches, its cemeteries. If you'd asked a resident in 1961 what the future held, they might have shrugged and said things were quiet. They would not have said the town was doomed. A year later, they would have been less sure. On the evening of May 27, 1962, 5 members of Centralia's volunteer fire company set a landfill on fire. This was the town dump, or rather, it was a dump that sat in the remains of an old strip mine, an open pit near the Oddfellows Cemetery at the southern end of town. The Borough Council had discussed the cleanup at a meeting on May 7th. Memorial Day was approaching, and the landfill was an eyesore, overflowing, smelly, attracting rats. The solution they settled on was the one small towns across Pennsylvania had used for decades: burn it. There is an important fact here. In 1958, 4 years before the Centralia Council made this decision, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania had passed a law specifically prohibiting dump fires in the vicinity of abandoned mines. The reason was exactly what you'd expect: the risk of igniting underground coal seams. The council knew this. According to David DeKok, the journalist who spent more than 30 years investigating the Centralia fire, the council's own minutes from that May 7th meeting do not specify the cleanup method. He surmises they left it out because the method they chose was illegal. The firefighters lined the pit with incombustible material, or tried to, and lit the trash. It burned. They doused it with water from hoses run up from Locust Avenue. Everything appeared to be under control. 2 days later, on May 29th, the fire was burning again. They doused it again. On June 4th, another flare-up. The firefighters were baffled. They raked through the remains of the burned garbage looking for the source. What they didn't know, what they couldn't see, was that the fire had already found a passage. An unsealed opening at the edge of the landfill led down into the abandoned mine workings below. The fire had entered the Buck Mountain coal seam. It was underground now, feeding on anthracite in the dark, spreading through the maze of tunnels and voids that the bootleg miners of the Depression had left behind. Those collapsed passages, the ones created by pillar robbing 30 years earlier, were not just empty space. They were ventilation. They were oxygen. The fire had found a labyrinth built for it, though nobody had intended it that way. By August, the situation was serious enough that state mine inspectors were conducting almost daily carbon monoxide readings in the mine workings around Centralia. On August 9th, 1962, the readings came back lethal. Every mine near the town was permanently closed that day. Centralia's last connection to its founding industry was severed not by economics, but by the fire its own council had set. And then something else happened that would shape the next 2 decades. The true origin of the fire was obscured. Officials began describing it as a case of spontaneous combustion, coal igniting on its own, deep underground, a natural occurrence. The dump fire was downplayed. The illegal burn was not discussed. It would be years before the full story of May 27th was publicly established, and by then the fire was beyond anyone's reach. What followed was 2 decades of failure so methodical it almost reads as farce, except that real people were breathing the air. The very first attempts to fight the fire, Excavating burning material, dousing it, failed for lack of money. Some estimates suggest that an additional $10,000 to $20,000 committed in the summer of 1962 might have contained the fire while it was still small. Other estimates put the figure at $50,000. Either way, the sums were modest. But Pennsylvania was already spending heavily on mine fires elsewhere in the anthracite region, and there was no sense of urgency. Nobody could predict how fast this particular fire would spread, and so the moment passed. By the spring of 1963, the first serious extinguishment project, a drilling and flushing operation, ran out of funding before completion. A new plan called for trenching, digging a barrier between the fire and the town. But when crews drilled down, they discovered the fire had reached depths of 225 feet. No trench could go that deep. A revised approach used barriers of crushed stone and water, but winter weather froze the equipment and the water lines. The contractors, worried they didn't have enough material to fill the mine voids, elected to fill them only halfway. The fire, of course, moved through the space they'd left. By the time the project ran over budget by $20,000 and was shut down, the fire had advanced 700 feet. In 1969, the U.S. Bureau of Mines installed experimental barriers made of fly ash, a byproduct of coal-fired power plants, in an attempt to wall off the fire's advance. They also left open a vent pit, designed to draw the fire's gases upward and away from the town. This worked, or seemed to, for about a decade. Locust Avenue was quiet. People went about their lives. The fire was there, somewhere underneath, but it wasn't in anyone's basement. Not yet. Then, in 1979, the Bureau of Mines closed the vent pit. The reasoning was bureaucratic. The details are murky. What is clear is that without the vent drawing gases away from the town, the fire broke through the fly ash barrier that had been holding it in check. For the first time, the mine fire moved directly beneath the streets of Centralia. It was under the houses now, under the sidewalks, under Locust Avenue. On the morning of November 21, 1979, John Coddington noticed thin wisps of steam rising from a vacant lot next to his gas station at the corner of South Street and Locust Avenue. Coddington was not just the owner of Centralia's only gas and service station, he was also the mayor. He was a practical man. 2 days later, when officials measured the temperature of the steam, it registered 122 degrees. The Department of Environmental Resources began monitoring the temperature in Coddington's underground fuel tanks. What they found was alarming. The gasoline in those tanks had reached 172 degrees Fahrenheit. To grasp what that means, the flash point of gasoline, the temperature at which its vapors can ignite, is around negative 45 degrees. Coddington's fuel was sitting at 172. The state police fire marshal ordered the tanks drained and filled with water. In early December of 1979, Centralia's only gas station closed for good. It would be demolished on November 9, 1981, one of the first buildings in the borough torn down because of the fire. Today, if you walk to the corner of South Street and what was Locust Avenue, you can still see a patch of weathered asphalt where the station stood. There is nothing else. For the next year, the situation deteriorated. Carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide seeped into basements. Residents kept detectors in their homes. Some people reported headaches, dizziness, nausea. But there was something strange about Centralia in this period, a kind of surreal adaptation. In winter, the warm ground melted the snow. Residents didn't have to shovel their sidewalks. In some spots, tomatoes grew in midwinter gardens, ripening in January from the heat below. The ground in places glowed a faint blue from methane escaping through cracks. One resident, an ex-hippie and short-order cook named Tom Larkin, would later demonstrate the absurdity of daily life in Centralia by placing a skillet on the heated ground and frying an egg. The photograph of that moment, a man cooking breakfast on the earth itself, became one of the defining images of the town's slow catastrophe. Then came Valentine's Day, 1981. February 14th was a Saturday. A group of state politicians happened to be in Centralia that day, meeting with borough officials about the fire. In a small town, word travels. Florence Domboski sent her 12-year-old son, Todd, to find out why the outsiders were there. Walking through his grandmother's backyard, Todd noticed thin wisps of smoke rising from a grassy patch near a tree. He walked over to investigate. The ground gave way beneath him. Todd Domboski dropped into a sinkhole 4 feet across and 150 feet deep. Steam billowed up around him. Steam later found to contain lethal concentrations of carbon monoxide. Had he stayed in that hole for a few more minutes, he would have suffocated. He saved his own life by grabbing a tree root and clinging to it until his 14-year-old cousin, Eric Wolfgang, reached down and hauled him out. Below Todd's dangling feet was the mine fire itself, burning in the void of a collapsed shaft that old maps showed had once existed at that location. The politicians in town that day saw the aftermath almost immediately. The sinkhole, the steam, the boy who had very nearly been swallowed by the ground he'd walked on his entire life. Media coverage exploded. Centralia, which had been a local story for nearly 20 years, became a national one overnight. In some areas, by 1981, the fire was visible at the surface. When measured, the temperatures at certain vents exceeded 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. Trees died in patches, their roots cooked from below. The parochial school at St. Ignatius Church, the school where Centralia's children had been educated since 1896, was closed that year when parents grew terrified that carbon monoxide and other gases were sickening their kids. The priest left too, relocating to Mount Carmel out of safety concerns. A town that had once supported 7 churches was watching its congregations scatter. The near death of Todd Domboski was the crisis point, but what happened next was not a rescue. It was a fracture. The residents of Centralia split into 2 camps, and the division was bitter. On one side were people like John Coddington and Tom Larkin, residents who wanted the government to buy their homes and relocate them. They had been living with the gases, the heat, the sinkholes. They wanted out. On the other side was a faction led by Helen Womer, a bank teller who had lived in Centralia her entire life. Helen Womer's house stood on Wood Street, terrifyingly close to the fire's origin point near the Oddfellows Cemetery, and yet she denied the fire posed any real danger. She fought relocation with a ferocity that baffled outsiders and infuriated her neighbors. Her husband, Carl, would later become the town's last official mayor. When a journalist visited Carl Womer decades later and asked about the mine fire, the old man was hosing down his porch in preparation for a Memorial Day picnic. His response, "What mine fire? If you go up and see a fire, you come back and tell me." Borough council meetings devolved into shouting matches. Friendships collapsed. An organization called Concerned Citizens, formed to advocate for relocation, began to fray from internal conflict. Threats were made. The fire burned on, indifferent to all of it, advancing through the coal seams at a pace measured not in yards per day, but in feet per month. Slow enough to deny, fast enough to doom. On March 6, 1983, the town staged what was called Unity Day, a rally meant to bring the community together, attract media attention, and pressure politicians. It succeeded at the second and third of those goals. It failed at the first. By this point, the fire had spread beneath approximately 195 acres. It was under the town. It was heading toward a gas pipeline. The neighboring village of Burnsville was threatened. On July 12, 1983, the results of a comprehensive federal study were announced. Total excavation of the fire, digging it out entirely, would cost an estimated $660 million. The project would require destroying a significant number of homes in the process. For context, the entire borough of Centralia, all its remaining property and infrastructure combined, was worth a tiny fraction of that. The arithmetic was stark. You could either spend $660 million to fight a fire under a town of 1,400 people, or you could spend a fraction of that to move the people somewhere else. On August 11, 1983, the residents of Centralia were asked to vote. The vast majority chose relocation. The town's fate was sealed. Congress appropriated $42 million for what was officially named the Centralia Mine Fire Acquisition Relocation Project. Beginning in late 1983 and accelerating through 1984, families began leaving. The process was voluntary at first. A homeowner would accept the government's buyout offer, compensation for their property, typically enough to purchase a comparable house in a nearby town like Ashland or Mount Carmel. and leave. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania would acquire the deed and, in time, demolish the structure. One by one, the houses on Locust Avenue came down, then the shops, then the municipal building, then the churches. Each demolition left a gap in the streetscape that the neighbors could see from their front porches, like watching a mouth lose its teeth. The people who left first wrote letters back. The people who stayed sometimes wished they had gone. The people who refused to leave watched the demolition crews with something between defiance and grief. By the end of 1986, according to David DeKok, fewer than 50 homes remained standing in Centralia. More than 1,000 people had relocated. More than 500 structures had been demolished. The grid of streets remained, curbs, sidewalks, fire hydrants, but the buildings were gone. It was as if someone had lifted the town off its own skeleton. In 1990, the census recorded 63 remaining residents. In 1992, Governor Robert P. Casey declared eminent domain over every remaining property in the borough. The state condemned the buildings. It forcibly acquired the deeds. The holdouts, Helen and Carl Warmer, the Hynoski family, a handful of others, mounted a legal challenge. In 1995, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court upheld the evictions. But then something strange happened. The new governor, Tom Ridge, wanted nothing to do with the fight. The state, which had seized the properties, essentially lost its nerve. The remaining residents were allowed to stay, living rent-free and tax-free in homes they no longer legally owned. In 1993, the stretch of Route 61 that had run through Centralia was permanently closed. The road had buckled, cracked, split apart from the heat beneath it. Steam poured from the fissures. A bypass was built to reroute traffic around the town. The abandoned stretch of highway, 3/4 of a mile of broken, tilting asphalt with smoke curling from its seams, would eventually become known as the Graffiti Highway, covered in spray paint by the tourists who came to gawk at the town that was burning alive. In 2020, the landowner buried it under tons of dirt. St. Ignatius Church, one of the earliest Catholic parishes in Centralia, built in 1869, with a congregation that had once numbered over 3,000, held its last Mass on June 25, 1995. The building was razed in November of 1997. Its cemetery remains. In 2002, the U.S. Postal Service discontinued Centralia's zip code, 17927. A town without a zip code is a town the federal government has decided, for practical purposes, no longer exists. In 2013, after years of litigation, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and the remaining residents reached a settlement. 7 people were permitted to live out their lives in their homes. Upon each resident's death, the property would pass to the state. They received a combined cash payout of $349,500. Carl Womer, Helen's widower, settled separately, receiving $82,000 for his house, the only remaining house in the mine fire impact zone. Here is the irony that no one had to point out, because the numbers did it on their own. In 1950, the Centralia Borough Council spent money to acquire the mineral rights to the anthracite beneath the town. They believed that coal was the town's future. They were right. The deposits beneath Centralia are enormous, estimated to be worth hundreds of millions, perhaps billions of dollars. And now those deposits are on fire. The thing the council bet the town's future on is the thing that destroyed it, not the exhaustion of coal, not the market turning to oil and gas, though it did, not a mine collapse, though those happened. The coal itself burning, the fortune beneath their feet turning to smoke. Some of the holdout residents alleged a conspiracy. They claimed in court filings that the relocation effort was a scheme to seize those mineral rights, that powerful interests wanted the town emptied so the coal could eventually be extracted. Their attorney argued that the borough owned the mineral rights, and that once Centralia ceased to exist as a municipality, those rights would revert to the state, which could sell them to a mining company. State officials dismissed this as a conspiracy theory. A coal company called Blashak built a warehouse for mining activities right across the borough line within the fire's supposed impact area around 2004, a fact the holdouts cited as evidence that the fire was not as dangerous as the government claimed. The truth of these allegations has never been formally resolved. What is beyond question is that the coal is still there, and it is still burning, and no one can touch it. Today, Centralia is not quite a ghost town in the way that phrase is usually meant. There is no tumble-down Main Street, no swinging saloon doors, no picturesque ruin. It is something stranger. It is a grid. You can drive the streets, Center Street, Locust Avenue, Wood Street, Park Street, and what you see is grass. Paved roads with curbs and sidewalks leading to empty lots where houses stood. The occasional set of concrete front steps rising to nothing. A fire hydrant standing in a meadow. The street signs have been removed. If you didn't know the town's history, you might think you'd wandered into an unfinished subdivision. A developer's plat that was cleared and surveyed but never built. The irony, of course, is the opposite. This place was fully built, fully inhabited, fully alive. It was unbuilt. Deliberately, methodically, house by house, the structures were torn down and hauled away. The ground was graded. Nature moved in. One holdout, a man named John Komarniski, actually moved to Centralia after the mine fire started. He was, at one point, one of the town's youngest residents at 45. He saw the emptiness differently than most. "We've gone from small-town America to state park America," he told a reporter. "People in the Poconos pay big money for this." He pointed down the long, abandoned street that led to his house. "There used to be a gas station out my kitchen window. Now there's just grass and trees. I've even got a nice long driveway." Other former residents came back when they could. Mary Chapman, who left in 1986, returned once a month to a social club that somehow persisted. "I loved it," she said. "I always liked Centralia from the time I was old enough to understand what it was." The 2006 horror film Silent Hill drew its setting loosely from Centralia's story. A screenwriter's father had been a mine engineer in the region, and the movie brought a new wave of curious visitors to the borough. They came to see smoke rising from the ground, to photograph the cracks in the hillside, to stand in the middle of a state highway that had been closed because the earth beneath it was on fire. The town became, for a certain kind of tourist, a destination. It was the most famous place in Pennsylvania that no longer existed. But not all of it is gone. On a hill at the north end of what was Centralia, overlooking the empty borough below, the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary Ukrainian Catholic Church still stands. It is a small white building with a bright blue dome, built in 1911 by the families of Eastern European miners who had come to dig coal and stayed to build lives. In 1987, when the state was preparing to demolish everything in the fire's path, engineers surveyed beneath the church and discovered that the building sits on solid rock, not coal. The fire cannot reach it. Plans to raise it were abandoned. Every Sunday, roughly 50 people drive to Centralia from surrounding communities, Ashland, Mount Carmel, Numidia, and climb the hill to attend Divine Liturgy. Almost all of them are former Centralia residents or their descendants. In 2015, the head of the worldwide Ukrainian Catholic Church, Major Archbishop Sviatoslav Shevchuk, visited the church and was so moved that he designated it a holy site of pilgrimage. Reader's Digest ran a cover story, "The Church That Wouldn't Burn." There is a woman named Joanne Pankow who relocated to nearby Numidia but still makes the drive every Sunday. She is the third generation of her family to belong to Assumption. Her grandparents went there. Her parents were married there. She was baptized and married there. Her parents were buried from there. Her 3 children were baptized there. "It's a big part of my life," she told a reporter. The fire, meanwhile, continues. The Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection monitors it monthly. Surface inspections, borehole temperature readings. Current estimates put the burning zone at roughly 400 acres, reaching depths of up to 300 feet. The fire is advancing along multiple fronts through the coal seams that radiate outward from the original ignition point near the old Odd Fellows Cemetery. Scientists project it could continue for another 2.5 centuries, given the quantity of anthracite still available to feed it. There is no plan to extinguish it. The last serious extinguishment proposal, in the 1990s, carried a price tag of $663 million. David DeKok, who covered the Centralia story from the early 1980s, who wrote 2 books on the fire and hundreds of newspaper articles, once described the situation in terms that are hard to improve on. Centralia was a pleasant community of about 1,435 people in 1962, he said. The fire that destroyed it was a direct legacy of 100 years of coal mining and the failure of government or private industry to face up to the damage that had been done. The firemen piled the trash in one corner of the pit, set it afire, and later washed down the smoldering ashes with fire hoses. But that year, things went horribly wrong, and the fire found its way through a hole in the pit into the vast, black labyrinth of abandoned coal mines that lay beneath Centralia. The Borough Council tried desperately to put out the underground fire, but after a few days, it was beyond their reach. After a few days. That's the part that stays with you. The window in which the fire was stoppable was measured in days. The window in which it was stoppable for a reasonable sum was measured in weeks. The window in which the town could have been saved, with aggressive funding, with a sense of urgency, with someone in Harrisburg or Washington deciding that 1,400 people in a quarter-square-mile borough in Columbia County were worth the investment, lasted perhaps a year, maybe two. Then the fire was in the labyrinth, in the bootleg miners' voids, in the pillar-robbed chambers, and no amount of money could guarantee catching it. And here is the number that closes the circle. Between 1962 and 1982, all levels of government combined spent approximately $7 million fighting the Centralia mine fire. $7 million over 20 years, an average of $350,000 per year, adjusted for nothing, ignoring inflation entirely. $350,000 a year to fight a fire under a town. The relocations alone cost $42 million. The fire, which could have been extinguished for the price of a modest house in 1962, has now consumed, in total spending, more than $50 million, erased a community, and rendered billions of dollars of natural resources permanently inaccessible. The coal is burning. You cannot mine what is on fire. If you visit Centralia today, and people do, thousands of them every year, driving up from Philadelphia and down from Scranton, pulling off the bypass onto the borough's empty streets, you will see, eventually, the hill at the north end of town and the small white church with the blue dome at the top of it. On a clear day, from the churchyard, you can look south across the entire footprint of what was Centralia. The streets are still there, the curbs, the hydrants. In winter, if the conditions are right, you'll notice patches where the snow doesn't stick, warm spots in the ground where the heat from below comes close enough to the surface to melt it. Steam may drift from cracks in the hillside behind you. The air may carry a faint smell of sulfur, and below all of it, below the churchyard, below the empty grid, below the meadows that were neighborhoods, and the driveways that end in weeds, the coal burns. It burned when the town was alive. It burned as the town was dismantled. It will burn long after the last resident is gone, and the last church service is held, and the last tourist turns the car around on the bypass. Anthracite is a patient fuel. It takes a long time to make and a long time to consume. The seams beneath Centralia accreted over millions of years. Organic swamp matter compressed into carbon so dense and so pure, it burns almost without smoke. The fire that is eating them now will take centuries to finish. Locust Avenue runs north to south through the center of the borough, same as it always did. The pavement is intact. The curbs are intact. In the 1890s, this was a street with 5 hotels and 27 saloons, with miners coming off shift and children running between the storefronts and the smell of coal smoke hanging in the air like weather. Today, if you walk its length, and you can, there is nothing to stop you. You will hear almost no sound at all. Wind in the grass, maybe a bird, the occasional car on the bypass a quarter mile to the west, your own footsteps on a road that leads, in both directions, to nothing that is still there.